So I thought we'd talk about Christmas today for some reason. I'm not sure why, but I thought it might be a good idea. We have Education Sunday today, so I thought we'd look at some of the things about Christmas, which are facts, history, images, evolution, things like that. Um, I think a lot of this is stuff you know already. I'm guessing, but why not? Let's go ahead and do this anyway, right? So um, that doesn't work. Okay. So the first question I want to ask is, when was Jesus born? Okay. And I want to spend some time talking about, the dates of his birth. And so, and I put all this stuff up on the screen so you can read it if you want. Um, but just you can see what we're doing. As we just said in Sunday school, Matthew and Luke are the only two that talk. You want to make a comment? The last slide. Okay. Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Nice.
So what does that tell us? It's not a photo of the actual event. Okay. Maybe somebody painted this years later. Maybe, it's my guess. I don't know. But I thought I'd add a little class to the presentation by putting a classical painting of the Nativity, and then she destroys it right away. So
It's not your fault.
it's not my fault. It's not my fault he made Joseph 87 years old. I can't help that either. So, maybe that's his great grandpa. I don't know. Okay, we're out of time now. We're done. Thanks for coming. Okay, so Jesus' birth is only mentioned in Matthew and Luke. Neither one of them do give us a date, but they give us some clues. And so what we're going to do, by the way, this has been something that Christians have wrestled with for a long time. Everybody seems to want to know when Jesus was born. And what's that?
Christmas Eve.
What about Christmas Eve?
That's when he was born.
This is going to be an interesting talk, I can tell. um, so, so back to the scholarly part. Scholarship basically is almost universally agrees that he was born between 6 and 4 BC. So between 6 and 4 years before Jesus was born. And they know this from three kinds of evidences. One is historical facts that are mentioned mostly in Luke, but maybe a little bit in Matthew. Second one, as you can see, is working backwards from the start of the ministry of Jesus. And the third one is astronomical observations. So I thought we'd take a look at those real quick just so you can see what we're talking about here. There's quite a bit of history reference, especially in Luke. And both Matthew and Luke talk about King Herod being involved in the whole narrative of Jesus' birth. We know that King Herod died in 4 BC. So Jesus couldn't have been born after that, assuming that the narratives linking him to Herod are correct. He couldn't have been born after 4 BC. But remember, and I think we alluded to this morning with the wise guys moving all over the Davidson's house, that when Herod asked the Magi, well, that Magi mentioned the king of the Jews, and he said, "When did you see the sign?" And then based on whatever they told him, he had all the 2-year-olds and younger boys killed. That implies that it was 2 years before. So, and by the way, scholars now think that maybe between 12 and 20 boys were killed in that massacre. So it wasn't like thousands, but between 12 and 20 might have been killed in Bethlehem who were of the right age. And of course, Jesus and his family had escaped by that point. But the point being that it could have been 2 years before that, you know, and so that means that Jesus couldn't have been, the latest year could have been 6 BC. So that's where they get the 4 to 6 BC, sometime in that realm of time. Pontius Pilate is another historical character that's in there. We know that he was the governor of Judea from 26 to 36 AD. If you assume that Jesus was about 33 years old, and we'll see why we assume that when he was crucified, that easily fits into a birth year between 4 and 6 BC. So that works. Now, the fly in the ointment, the part that doesn't fit, is the census of Quirinius, okay? Which Luke mentions. That's why they went to Bethlehem. It was because they had to go have the census that was ordered by the Roman governor Quirinius. I had trouble saying Quirinius. That's it, Quirinius. And he is Publius Quirinius. That's his name. Okay, if you got Latin down, you could probably understand that. He died in 21 AD. He was appointed the Roman governor of Syria in 6 AD, and that's when he first came to the region, was 6 AD, and he ordered the census to find out what he was being given. Okay, so this census is real. We know it really happened. And Judea was added to his protectorate, his governorship, just for the purposes of the census. So all that hangs together, but that's a good 10 years after Jesus was born. So what do we do with that information? Doesn't seem to fit. Now, there were lots of censuses being taken during that time period. Luke wrote this, as Matt pointed out, 80, 90 years after Jesus' birth. Luke could have just made a mistake. He could just simply have gotten the famous census in his head and assign that to some other census, you know. So most scholars just say this is not a big deal. There's too much other evidence to say 4 to 6 BC. Okay, so we're not going to worry about this. But that could have been, you know, who knows what's going on. That's the one historical fact that doesn't fit very well.
Well, and so Luke had to get Jesus to Bethlehem.
Yeah.
Matthew had to get Jesus to Bethlehem.
You got to do it somehow.
You got to do it somehow.
Well, without beating up on the whole narrative too much, there's absolutely no reason whatsoever they had to go to the city of their fathers to be recorded in the census. That was probably something they did just to get him to Bethlehem, which is where the prophecies say the Son of God was, the Son of David was going to be born. So,
It's the intent of their gospel. Remember, they're not trying to write historical.
yeah. So he probably just pulled this out of air and said, okay, this is why they're going to Bethlehem, because why else would they be going to Bethlehem? You know, sort of things.
Because he's from Nazareth.
He's from Nazareth, but Joseph and Mary's families both had connections back to Bethlehem, which is going to become important in a moment. So there you go. So that whole census business is a little sketchy. So and most of the narrative doesn't, you know, rely on that, so it doesn't really matter. So what about working backwards from the start of Jesus' ministry? Okay, well, Luke says Jesus was about 30 years of age when he started his ministry. Okay, not exactly 30 years, about 30 years. Thank you, Luke, for not giving us a definite date, which would have helped a lot, right? Luke also says that John the Baptist began baptizing people in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, who was the emperor of Rome. And that puts that year at AD 28, 29. And the reason why it's 2 years is because the Roman calendar kind of straddles our calendar. Okay, so it's either in late 28, early 29. Okay, is when John the Baptist started his ministry. That's all nailed down pretty tight. That puts the birth year of Jesus no later than 1 BC, right? But since about 30 years old means he could have been 33 years old, you know, that doesn't really do violence to the whole idea of 4 to 6 BC. So most scholars say, yeah, 4 to 6 still looks pretty good. Okay. Then we know from John, okay, the Gospel of John, that there was a reconstruction that Herod was doing on the temple, and John says that was in the 46th year of that reconstruction when Jesus began his ministry. So we know when Herod started that reconstruction of the temple, So we can use that number to come up with another date between 27 and 29 AD, which fits nicely with Luke. Okay, and so all of that seems to hold together pretty well, and you can backdate it then to 4 BC, 6 BC, whatever number you want to choose there. Now, most scholars now say there was not a literal Star of Bethlehem. That, I know. Most scholars say, that's probably a figurative thing because astronomically, how in the world do you get any kind of an astronomical thing like that to sit still for 2 years, shining on one spot? That's not the way the atmosphere the space works, So it's not likely that that was real. It was probably a theological point. The intent of the scripture was to illustrate that. But if it was historical, people have said, what could that have been? What could the Star of Bethlehem be? It's an unusual thing in the heavens, right? So in 2 BC, there was a close planetary conjunction between Venus and Jupiter, two very bright planets. They were really close together in the night sky, and it would have looked especially bright. So it could easily have been something like that. There was a comet in 5 BC that went flashing through the Middle East. Maybe that was it. Those are the two best possibilities. But they both fit pretty close to the dates that we're talking about. Now let's talk about this, why Jesus was born BC before himself. Okay, this has always caused problems. And so our modern calendar, which does the AD BC thing, the split at Jesus' birth, didn't come about until 525 AD, in which a pope asked this monk named Dionysius to come up with an accurate calendar that they could use. And they wanted to emphasize Jesus' birth, of course. Unfortunately, Dionysius missed the real calendar break between AD and BC by at least 4 years. He was off. And the reason why he was off seems to be because he was trying to reconcile a lot of folk religion that was going around at the time about the possible end of the world 500 years after Jesus had died, and which that was coming up really quick, and or maybe it already happened, or maybe from his birth. And there was a lot of folk stuff because people thought 500 was somehow a magical number, and that God had to be constrained by 500 years on Earth for the whole universe. That doesn't make sense, but that's what people think that way. And then he was also trying to figure out a logical number of years from the creation of the earth before Jesus' birth. He was trying to put all that together and introduced at least 3, maybe 4 major errors into the whole process because none of that is accurate. Okay, so that led him to make the calendar wrong. That's the bottom line. So when they finally realized what was going on, Jesus ends up being born before he arrives on Earth. Before the magic 0. There's another problem there, by the way. The Romans did not have the concept of a 0. So they went from 1 BC to 1 AD, which means you miss a year. There's no 0 year. Okay, and that's interesting because the concept of 0 is a really difficult mathematical concept. It didn't really become common in the Western world until later on. At that point, the Mayas had it. The Mayas had developed the concept of 0, and that's why they had the most accurate astronomical observations in the world at the time. But Europe did not have it. So we have that problem too. We have a missing year in there. So take it for what it's worth. So all of that is why we have that. Now, why do we celebrate Christmas on December 25th? This is a good question, and a lot of people have wondered about this. And the earliest mention for that was by Hippolytus, an early church father. He was a Christian, early 200s, 200 years after Jesus' birth approximately. He assumed, and he just made this assumption, that Jesus was conceived on March 25th. And therefore 9 months later is December 25th. Okay? And he could count those months and he could figure out that because they knew what the average gestation period was for a human. They could figure that out. The reason why he wanted Jesus conceived on March 25th is because it's real close to the spring equinox. And for theological reasons, he likes the idea of the Savior of the world being born about the same time that flowers start blooming. And we get March, and we get spring, and we get rebirth, and so forth. So it all seemed to make sense to him. December 25th also works from a Christian symbolism point of view because the days start getting longer, and it provides hope, and that's what Jesus did with his birth. Yes?
Was Easter?
Now we're getting to Easter in a minute.
Okay, was that before?
Don't get ahead of me here. That's the next slide. You're a prophet, aren't you? You saw that next slide. You said, I'm going to scoop this guy, man. Another church father, this guy, Sextus Julius Africanus, decided in 221 AD, we have an exact date on him, that March 25th was not only the day that Jesus was conceived, but also the day the earth was created back in the day. You know, and he loved the idea that the earth was created and Jesus was created on the same day. That seemed to be important to him. And again, if you add 9 months, you get December 25th. So that's kind of how that started.
Clearly, babies are 9 months to the day.
Of course. Isn't that how all of you did your family planning? It's exactly to the moment, 3:30 in the afternoon. We had it planned out. I mean, yeah, well, we won't go into that right now. Our grandson Ray, though, came, 3 weeks late? It was some crazy thing like that. And Teresa sat there the whole time waiting for that baby to be born, and he would not come out. He's been a problem ever since, I'll tell you. So here's the Easter thing, and Chris was definitely onto something here, okay? Definitely onto something, because Easter was celebrated right around the spring equinox for good theological reasons also, because the resurrection is hope, and of course spring is a time of hope, and we're all still looking forward to it already, I think, spring coming. So and it was common at that time in the Christian world to assume that great prophets like Jesus, great people, were conceived into the afterlife. That means they died on the same day that they were conceived into the world. So that there was a kind of a connection there. Okay. Again, I'm not sure why they thought that was important, but it's something that was a common thing. So he dies about Easter time, approximately in March. So he must have been conceived about that same time, which again, add 9 months, and then you get December 25th. So all that worked. Another line of evidence suggests that Passover was held on a Hebrew month called Nisan, the 14th day of Nisan, and that corresponds to March 25th. Okay? So there was a lot of Jewish influence in the early Christian church. Of course, it was basically a Jewish denomination for a long time. So it's assumed that the great events in the life of Jesus have to also be associated with Nisan 14, because that's the greatest of the Jewish festivals, and that gives a birthday of December 25th, if he was conceived on that day. So that's how all that comes together. Now, why do we celebrate Christmas on December 25th? There's also another line of evidence to suggest that it was influenced by Roman festivals. There were two of them, which maybe one or the other or both were involved in doing this. One is the Roman festival, the winter solstice, which is called Saturnalia, because it was a festival in honor of Saturn, the god of agriculture. And it was a blowout, full tilt, no holds barred party. I mean, it was crazy stuff. Okay. The other one was Natalis Solis Invicti, which is the festival of the sun god. And emperors kind of associated themselves because they wanted people to think of them as the sun god. And here's an image I found of that event. Who wouldn't want to be this guy right here? Riding a chariot from the sun with 4 charging horses. I mean, that looks pretty cool. Every emperor in the world is going to want to be that guy, So, and that was on December 25th. And in either case, they assumed that Christians wanted to co-opt those festivals and try to convince Romans, who they were trying to convert, that their festival was better and was going to take over for the Roman festivals. So that's kind of the assumption that was made. And as a note here, in the 1600s, Sir Isaac Newton also said it was the winter solstice that did this. And Newton, of course, invented gravity and calculus and a bunch of other stuff that made our world work. But he also was a theologian, and he wrote some serious theology. And part of it was his belief that the winter solstice was why it was a December 25th. But that was also, Newton was born on December 25th himself. So I think he liked the idea of just sharing a birthday with Jesus. I think that was kind of cool. Yeah.
Why would the Romans celebrate a sun god on the darkest time of the year?
Because it was the shortest day of the year and things were getting better. The sun was coming back.
Okay, the sun was coming back.
This is like, see, and that's what's being portrayed here. The sun coming in a chariot, to the earth. Sun is coming back. Things are going to be okay. It's not going to be 12 degrees for the rest of your life,
Follow-up question.
Yes.
Do we know how short the sun, like how short the days are? I mean, they're pretty short.
No. Rome is almost exactly our latitude. Rome is almost exactly our latitude.
You think of it as being so far south.
It's not. Europe is way north, really far north. So almost all of it is farther north than we are here in Platteville. So central Canada is where you're.
I was mistaking Middle East for Rome.
There you go. But it was the winter solstice came a little bit later at that point because of the precession of the sun. So it's probably the 23rd or 24th rather than the 21st or 22nd. So,
I was wondering about that.
so it puts it closer to the 25th.
So is the solstice moving further?
Yeah, everything's moving up there. So it just takes a long time. In any one lifetime, you're not going to notice it. But yeah, the moon is getting closer to the earth very gradually and things like that. So tides are changing very, 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 very slowly. Okay. Some have said there might be a reference to the date of the Feast of Dedication, a Jewish festival, which occurs, as you can see, on the 25th day of the Jewish month of Kislev. And to believe this, you have to assume Christians just substituted the word December for Kislev. This seems awfully weak to me, but who knows what people will come up with, so maybe that was it. So whatever reason, December 25th became official in 350 AD with the Pope saying this is the day Christmas happened, this is when Jesus was born. Although they'd already been starting to celebrate it on 25th earlier than that.
When was our calendar? Like
it's a Julian calendar. It's Pope Julius that was the calendar. Yeah, it was about that time that they were starting to make that the calendar we use today. And that's important too, because depending on how you arrange your calendar, it's going to change dates and things like that. So, but now we can ask this question: when was Jesus really born? Because he really wasn't born on the 25th of December. When was he really born? And here we have almost no evidence. We have one cryptic comment in Luke that says the shepherds were in the fields, and the critical part of that people pass over a lot was keeping watch over their flocks by night. That was crazy unusual. Shepherds did not usually stay up all night watching their flocks. They have to sleep sometime, right? But they were doing that at the time of Jesus' birth, and that means this is a time of baby sheep being born, lambs were being born. And they had to provide not only caring for the lambs and the mothers and ewes, they also had to protect them from predators. So they had to be extra diligent, they had to be awake all night long. Okay, so tough to be a shepherd. They were born in the spring. Lambs were born in the spring, usually March or April. So those are the two best guesses of when the actual day was. People guessed all other kinds of days. Recent scholars usually say yes, March or April. The Mormon Church did a whole bunch of research, as typical of them, and came up and said it's definitely the first part of April. The general consensus that people have now is that Jesus was born in the spring. April is the most common month, probably the first half of April, if you wanted to pin them down. But that's about as far as it goes. Yeah.
So on the nativity, when the shepherds holding the baby lamb, that could have actually been.
That could have been actually, yeah, he may have been having a lamb that was having trouble. He couldn't leave it, so he had to bring it to Jesus. You know, that's entirely possible. Yeah. Yeah. It is symbolic. It is symbolic, but I mean, it ties it to Easter. You know, because Easter is the Paschal Lamb tradition. That's kind of what that's all about. Okay, what about the Eastern Orthodox folks? This is, of course, a Christian denomination. We have Catholics, Protestants, and Eastern Orthodox, right? Before we had the Eastern Orthodox, there's still that part of the world of what today we would say the Slavic countries and so forth. There was a long tradition of celebrating Jesus on Epiphany, January 6th, and not December 25th. So January 6th is the big day in Orthodoxy, not the 25th. But the focus is on the Magi appearing, and then later on the baptism of Jesus, which they think occurred about that same time as well. And so they started celebrating the feast of Jesus early on January 6th. Oops, let me go back. Oh no, that's coming later. What about the Muslims? You're gonna say, why are we talking about the Muslims here? Well, as you may know, Islam is a religion that is all focused on prophets. They put a lot of emphasis on prophets, and they have a whole series of prophets, one after another, and it ties into their whole cosmology of how they see the world and things like that. And that's another Education Sunday if you ever want to go there, okay? But the greatest of all prophets, according to Islam, is Jesus. He is the #1 prophet in their whole list. And they have a long list of prophets, 50 of them, something like that. Jesus is the #1 guy, you know, more than Muhammad, more than anybody else, okay? And Jesus' birth is in the Quran, which is their holy scriptures. His miracles are in there. He's mentioned in there and so forth. So, of course, they're going to have an opinion about when he was born, right? This is a big dude for them. And one Muslim cleric had suggested a date in late March, essentially the spring equinox. So their line of thinking was the same as Christians' line of thinking, you know, in Islamic church. So it comes up with about the same date. And I should mention, I looked for an image of a Muslim image of Jesus being born, but you're not going to find them because they take the no graven images part of the Ten Commandments, which they have also, by the way. They have a lot of stuff. I mean, it's amazing how similar Judaism, Christianity, and Islam they are. They're all basically the same religion with three kind of, you know, approaches kind of thing. And they have a lot of the same stuff. They have the Ten Commandments, and they take the no graven image part really serious. So they don't have images of anybody who's holy because it's like an idolatry kind of thing. So they don't have images of Jesus. They don't have images of Muhammad. They don't have images of Allah, God. They don't have that stuff at all. So there aren't any. Okay. Now, we're a tenth of the way through, and I've used half my time. So I'm right on schedule.
Yes.
It's just typical of me. So I hope you brought cots and lunch because we're going to be here for hours. What about some facts about the birth of Jesus? What you see portrayed here are two things which are not true, and we will get to that in a moment. Okay, so let's do that. First of all, the marriage of Mary and Joseph. According to Jewish custom, Mary and Joseph would have already been married by the time the angel came and told Mary she was pregnant, okay, which is fancifully shown in this diagram here. But they would not have consummated their marriage. The way it was done is you got married, And then a year went by while mostly so the husband could get a house together and provide for the family before they consummated anything and started making babies. So that's how that worked. And so Mary they had not consummated their marriage according to Jewish custom. Okay. Now, this gives Joseph a chance to show some serious mercy at this point, because Mary was pregnant during that 1 year period. Okay. Joseph presumably knew he was not the father, right? He had every right, according to Mosaic law, to condemn her and have her stoned to death. That's exactly what the law says he should have done. He didn't do that. And it's probably a testimony to his faith and his mercy that he valued mercy over justice in this case, or over the adherence to the law. But it almost certainly ruined his reputation, and probably hers as well, but amongst people in Nazareth. So we have this event in Matthew 13:55, and people from Nazareth were unwilling to accept Jesus' ministry. And they said, because he was the carpenter's son, like you're one of his kids, like his being Pew, kind of stuff. So there's a good chance that Joseph ruined his reputation by showing mercy to Mary. Okay. Here's a bonus fact. Even though genealogies in the New Testament are all about Joseph, Mary was also a direct descendant of David. So Jesus was a son of David on both mother and father's side, not just on his father's side. Was Jesus born in a stable? No, he was not born in a stable. That's very unlikely, I should say. I wasn't there. I was the shepherd, had to stay in the fields watching the flocks. I didn't get to go. But the word they use in the Bible to describe the inn is not the word they use to describe what we think of as a public building where strangers can go and rent a room. We'd call it a hotel or a motel or something like that. It was not that kind of place at all. The word actually describes as a guest chamber in a private house where somebody would have like a guest room. So if you go visit your friends and they have a room kind of set aside, they might use it for all kinds of things. But when you come, they clean it up and make sure you have a bed to sleep in and things like that. That was the room that was referenced by the word when they went to see if there was any room in the house. It's the same word they use later on to describe the upper room where Jesus had Passover with his disciples just before his crucifixion. It's the same word for that, okay? A different word is used when they talk about a public building where people go and rent a room for the night. They use that word when they're talking about the parable of the Good Samaritan, because you remember the Good Samaritan took the wounded man to an inn and said, take care of him, I'll give you some money, I'll pay you more if I need to. That's that kind of a thing, and that's a different word. Okay. Now, an interesting question here is, given the poverty that seems to be typical of Mary and Joseph, it's probable they were staying with relatives in Bethlehem. Remember, this was the city, theoretically, Joseph's and probably Mary's families came from eventually at some point. They probably had relatives there. And that would make sense that they were staying with relatives. They couldn't have possibly have afforded anything else except sleeping on the ground outside the city with the rocks. That's about the only other thing they could have afforded. So it's probable that if indeed a census was going on and everybody was flocking back, that their relatives already had somebody else in the guest room. And so what they did was they put Mary and Joseph most likely in a small room down on the ground floor where they would bring the animals in on cold nights to let them kind of be protected a little bit. And that's almost certainly the room that Jesus was born in. If it makes sense from the words that are used, that's the most logical conclusion. Okay. How do we know that Mary and Joseph were poor? Well, Luke tells us this. 40 days after his birth, Jesus is taken to the temple and presented at the temple. We talked about this morning, Simon and Anna, were the kind of the focal points of that. But according to Mosaic law, the mother had to be purified after giving birth. Jesus had to be redeemed after being born. Okay, it would be similar to the notion that you baptize infants, but he wasn't baptized. I mean, that's not what happened, but that same kind of an idea. And of course, he was named at the time. That was when he got his name. The Torah says you have to make a sacrifice when you do this, and it should be a lamb. But the Torah also goes on to say that if you're really poor and you can't afford a lamb, 2 turtle doves or 2 pigeons will do. Probably pigeons, because they're the cheapest. And that's the sacrifice that Mary and Joseph made, with 2 pigeons or 2 turtle doves. So they were so poor that they got in on the, with the poor person's exemption. That's what the modern photograph shows. So here's another question. Given that poverty, how could they have afforded to go to Egypt and live for years, waiting for Herod to die? Or it wasn't years, but how could they afford to do that? They had no family in Egypt, nobody to take care of them, right? Well, presumably it was the gifts of the Magi that financed that. That's where they got the money from to do that. And that allowed them to leave and go to Egypt and wait out Herod's death before they could come back. Were Joseph and Jesus carpenters? Here's the one that's going to be a shocker. Probably not. Not the way we understand the term today, as a craftsman who works almost exclusively with wood. That's what we think a carpenter is. That's not what the word means that they use to describe. It's tekton is the word they use in Greek to describe Jesus, both Jesus and his father. And that's a generic word for a builder, somebody who works with their hands and builds things. And that's probably what Jesus and Joseph were. They probably had enough skills to work with wood when they had to, but they probably spent most of their time being stonemasons, because at that point in time and in that place, there was very little wood, and houses were built out of stone and mud. And so that's probably what Jesus and Joseph both were. It doesn't change anything, because the point of that is that they were working people and poor, and that works fine.
So that'd be like Jesus, the son of the contractor?
Yeah, it's kind of Jesus, the son of the contractor, yeah. It doesn't have the same ring to it. It's just the way it got translated in the King James Version, and everybody has just accepted it ever since. Here's a bonus fact. It's likely that Joseph died before Jesus reached the age of manhood. Mosaic law requires the eldest son to stay home and take care of his mother until he's 30 if the husband dies. Jesus didn't start his ministry until he was 30. That's pretty suspicious. And so there's a good chance that Joseph had died maybe in Jesus' teenage years. Who knows when it was, because we have no clue whatsoever. What? After 12, because they took him. So it had to have been probably teenage years or early adulthood. But it wouldn't be early adulthood, because Jesus would have left home by that point. So almost certainly it had to be teenage years, high school years. So he could start his ministry at 30 because he had younger brothers that could provide for Mary at that point. So
Jesus had siblings?
Jude, another one named Joseph, perhaps. Yeah, it's pretty clear. The Roman Catholic Church translates all those words as cousins, but the word actually is brother, so. That's because, you probably know, Roman Catholic Church says Mary was eternally virgin. She never had children by man. And that's exceedingly unlikely, given the words that are used in the New Testament. I thought I'd mention tekton is the source of the geologic term tectonic, which you may have heard of. It's a term which is used to describe any kind of building process, like seismic activity, earthquake activity, volcanoes. All those kind of mountain building processes are all lumped together and called tectonic processes, because they build stuff. Like Joseph and Jesus were builders who built stuff. The way you might have heard the term is in plate tectonics, which is the theory which holds everything together in the whole world. It's the most important geologic theory ever derived. And that's another Education Sunday if you ever want to get there. I did my master's degree on plate tectonics, so be prepared for a lot on that one. Okay. But I thought I'd throw this in too. I stumbled into this. Something I didn't know. Archaeologists recently have found a large rock quarry and stone vessel workshop located just outside Nazareth. And so here's a modern map, a recent map, and you see it's up there. It's about 3 miles. And this was active at the time that Joseph and Jesus were in Nazareth. So there's a pretty good chance that Joseph was a laborer in the stone quarry. Maybe Jesus too, who knows. Okay, evolution of Christmas celebrations. We're going to have to pick up the pace here a little bit. Sorry about that. Generally, and without, there are some exceptions, of course, always are, but mostly Christmas was celebrated for the first 1,000 years with very sacred religious ceremonies. Christmas, the term comes from Christ's Mass, a Mass being a Roman Catholic, service. So that's where it comes from. It was the Mass which celebrated Jesus. And so people went to church a lot and maybe had a feast afterwards, but it was very reverent kind of stuff. That's for the most part. I'm sure there were some people who did weird things at Christmas, but for the most part, that's what was going on. As Matt has pointed out, the 12 days of Christmas were basically a preparatory time for Epiphany. Epiphany was the big day. I mean, Christmas was not nearly as important as Epiphany was for the first 1,000 years or so. And so Epiphany and January 6th was the big day. And remember the Eastern Orthodoxy, it was the only day for them, pretty much. But it gradually became, and this is an important step, Charlemagne became emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. And as one historical wag has put it, the Holy Roman Empire was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. But Charlemagne became the emperor of that empire in 800 AD, and he chose to be coronated on Christmas Day. And this starts the secularization of Christmas, when others start taking it over from the religious idea and start adding other kinds of ideas to it. So a lot of kings thought that was a great idea. Other kings were getting coronated on Christmas, and kings started having giant feast, on Christmas Day. Here's an image of one, a modern image of one, trying to show their power by having these lavish banquets on Christmas Day, and starting to slowly move away from some of the religious aspects of this.
So Christmas has been commercialized well before the 20th.
Yeah, but nothing like what we're doing now. I mean, this was incredibly minor, but this is the very, very beginning of it. Now, before Christianization, before Christianity got to Northern Europe, they had winter festivals, and they were very, very important. And pre-Germanic peoples, and a lot of those are the genetic and cultural ancestors of modern Americans, including some of my family, celebrated a festival called Yule in December, late December, early January. Pre-Christian Celtic people over in the British Isles had winter festivals, and they were big into mistletoe and ivy, including kissing under the mistletoe. That was all part of what they did. The Yule celebrations were pretty rowdy, so were the pre-Celtic celebrations, pretty rowdy. And as these cultures became Christianized, they just brought some of those traditions with them right along. And so a lot of the traditions we have now come from Saturnalia, which is where gift giving started and so forth, that Roman blowout party. And these traditions brought a lot with us for the common secular traditions of Christmas. Often we took those secular traditions of Christmas and layered over a religious image or meaning for them, but the original thing came from a secular source. So by the Middle Ages, Christmas was a full blown on, wild, no holds barred party in Europe, especially in England, but also in Germany. And Scandinavia. Eating, drinking to drunkenness. There were special Christmas ales, that came out, dancing, singing, sporting events, gambling, card playing, promiscuity, all common, elaborate dinners, elaborate mass balls, and about as far from church as you can possibly get. Okay, so here are images of medieval Christmas. You know, guy drinking to about to pass out, wild parties going on, big banquets, costumes, you know, all that kind of stuff. That's kind of what we were doing. That's the Middle Ages. From the royal influence of the kings, we get carolers, but they weren't the carolers you're used to thinking of today. They were singing and dancing, and often the songs were lewd and not ones we'd sing in church today. A legacy of all of that is that we wish people Merry Christmas, as in eat, drink, and be merry. That's where that came from originally. A lot of other cultures don't say Merry Christmas, they say Happy Christmas. But we say Merry Christmas. Now, the Protestant Reformation had a big impact. This is with the beginning of the Protestant Church, which starts in the 1500s and accelerates in the 1600s. The Anglican Church, which we call Episcopalian in the United States, that was in England. Lutherans in Germany and Scandinavia, and later the Methodists, all celebrated Christmas and had no problem celebrating Christmas, okay? They tended to make it a little bit more religious than it had been in the medieval days, but they still celebrated Christmas. But the Calvinist tradition, as well as the Puritans, and these are major thrusts of Protestant faith, really important, both utterly rejected Christmas. They banned it. They said, we will not do this. And the reasons why is they were troubled by the pagan origins of a lot of what happens at Christmas time. They felt that Christmas was too Catholic. It was a Catholic thing. We don't want to do Catholic stuff. And a lot of them didn't like the Anglicans because the Anglicans were pretty Catholic in what they did. And that comes up to play in a minute. And they were really troubled by all the wild shenanigans and the partying and stuff that went on. They didn't want any part of that either. And the best known Calvinist group today is the Presbyterians. And they were leaders in the anti-Christian movement back in the day. Not today, but back in the day. So when we get to Scotland, it's essentially Presbyterian. In 1640, they outlawed Christmas, made it illegal to celebrate Christmas. England went through a pretty tough civil war between 1642 and 1651. It's mostly against the king, but it was very much religiously identified. Sort of like the current Syrian civil war, which is religiously identified too. Anglicans supported the monarchy. Puritans were the rebels against that. And by 1647, the Puritans, the anti-monarchy, anti-royalists, had a majority in Parliament, and they banned Christmas in England. They passed a law that banned Christmas in England. Here's the writing of it up here. Public notice, the observation of Christmas, having been deemed a sacrilege, exchanging of gifts and greetings, adopting and fine clothing, feasting, and similar satanic practices are hereby forbidden, with the offender liable for a fine of 5 shillings. And apparently that's an original document. When they did this, pro-Christmas rioting broke out all over England. And apparently this is a diagram showing the police putting down rioters who were in favor of Christmas. So it was a kind of a tough time. Now, the Puritans under Oliver Cromwell took power, and of course they abolished the monarchy and they continued banning Christmas for 9 years. When Charles II was, you know who Charles III is, right? This is the Charles before him, before the current king, was the King of England. He was restored in 1660. Monarchy came back. He lifted the ban on Christmas, and it also, from a religious point of history point of view, solidified the Anglican Church hold on England's religious life and marginalized the Puritans to a really strong degree. Here's a little ditty I found of people who were so happy that Christmas is back after Charles came back. Now thanks to God for Charles' return, whose absence made old Christmas mourn. For then we scarcely did it know whether it Christmas were or no. That's what people did before television, I this. In the colonial United States, New England, heavily Puritan and Calvinist, really strong. And they were really opposed to Christmas. And they made a point of living on December 25th just like any other day. The opposition due to anti-Catholic feeling, anti-Anglican feeling, they didn't like the Anglican Church. The fact that scriptures didn't mention its observance, connection to pagan rituals, and the boisterous tradition of Christmas celebrations. These were all the reasons why they did not like it. And Christmas formally banned in Boston in 1659. And here's that notice, which they have. And I'm not going to go through it all, but you are in trouble if you celebrate Christmas. Now, that ban was revoked by an Anglican governor of New England in 1651, but Boston did not commonly celebrate Christmas until well into the 1800s. It just simply wasn't done. So there's an old saying that's banned in Boston, and this is one of the things they banned in Boston. Christmas in the colonial United States and other places which weren't Calvinist, weren't Presbyterian, and weren't Puritan, they celebrated all the time. Here's a painting, Christmas Day in the 18th century by Peter Jackson, and that's the United States. But the American Revolution ended in 1781. Christmas fell out of favor, right, as soon as that happened. What was going on there was we were a new country and we were trying to build our identity. And we didn't know what kind of a country we were going to be. We just knew we didn't want to be England, right? And so anything that smacked of being English got rid of it. That's when all the spellings were changed, you know, from English spellings to American spellings. We didn't want those English spellings, you know, O-U-R and color and things like that. We didn't want that kind of stuff. So Christmas fell out because it was too English. But during the American Revolution, George Washington, who earns his fame by this event, if nothing else, but George Washington was a pretty cool guy. He did a lot of cool stuff. The day after Christmas, he fought a battle against the British during the Revolutionary War at Trenton, New Jersey. A brilliant tactical maneuver in which he routed the British Army. And this was important because up to that point, the revolution was faltering. It was about to collapse. The British were just about to win. And this turned the tide. And from that point on, success started following a little bit more regularly. This is the famous painting showing Washington crossing the frozen Delaware River to attack the British. The reason why I mention this is because after the Revolutionary War, Christmas was associated as a patriotic thing. That's when Washington destroyed the British. You know, that's what it really was. And I want to point this out. These are not random people. The artist put in real people who were at Trenton and put their faces in there and so forth. And this guy right here is Hugh Mercer, who was a general in Washington's army, really close to Washington, considered to be a very brave and courageous man. He was killed next year in battle. But I want to point him out because Hugh Mercer is the direct ancestor of my son-in-law, Eric Mercer. The direct lineal line straight down to my son-in-law, who is a Canadian. See, this is back when the Mercers were Americans. They went to Canada at some point and became Canadians. Okay, so I just thought I'd point that out. That's kind of fun to find that out. What about the revival of Christmas? I have 5 minutes. Let's see if I can get here. When did Christmas come back? 1823, huge moment. This guy, Clement Clark Moore, publishes A Visit from St. Nicholas. We usually call it The Night Before Christmas. You all know that poem. You know, not a creature was stirring, and so forth. Poem was crazy popular all over the country, and was rejuvenated Christmas in the U.S. as well as the beginning of the cult of Santa Claus. And that's the first time Santa Claus sort of became okay. The identification of Christmas as a time that ordinary people gave gifts. Many other Christmas traditions. It also is credited with beginning the American commercialization of Christmas. and the de-emphasizing of the religious meaning of Christmas. And in other words, More created a secular version of Christmas that was wildly popular. And it started taking over from the religious aspects of it. People were upset about that. Harriet Beecher Stowe, who wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, as you probably know, another one of her books nobody ever reads. The first Christmas in New England, in 1850, they were having their first Christmases in New England. This is the Calvinists, they're finally giving way. This is 200 years after it was originally banned. But she has a character who complains about the commercialization of Christmas in that book. So let's see how things would happen. Carols were revived in 1833 with the first publication of a non-body Christmas carol book. This is the first printing and common availability of both of the first Noel and of Hark the Herald Angels Sing and some other well-known carols. In 1843, the first commercial Christmas card was produced in England. Here it is. This is the first Christmas card ever. By U.S. examples in the 1870s, when Christmas cards became kind of common commercially. There were some private ones before that, but commercially, this guy named Louis Prang was the guy who kind of did that. And these are some really early Prang Christmas cards from the 1870s. So that's when Christmas cards started. Huge was the Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens, 1843. Huge impact. Dickens was crazy popular in the United States. The most popular author probably in the 19th century. And I throw this picture in because there's this little tiny town in the middle of absolutely nowhere in Nebraska with maybe 200 people in it, and it's called Dickens, Nebraska. They named this town in the middle of nowhere in rural Nebraska after Charles Dickens because he was so popular. Now that's got to be an indication of how popular you are. Anyway, you know the story of the Christmas Carol probably, and you know how it plays out. This was so popular in the United States, it completely reimagined Christmas for everybody. They took away all the inappropriate partying and all that kind of stuff and made it a time of family gatherings, a time of seasonal food and drink and appropriate frivolity, but mostly a festive generosity of spirit. That's the point of the Christmas Carol. And that's when that became associated with Christmas. And by itself, he did that. And standardized Merry Christmas as the term. That's what he used in his book. How about Christmas trees? Queen Victoria married Prince Albert in England in 1840. Albert was German. He emphasized the tradition of Christmas trees, which is a German idea, in England. And in 1848, actually, this engraving from a photograph of the royal family, Albert, Victoria, their children, standing around the Christmas tree was published. It was released in the United States in 1850 and was crazy popular. I mean, it's so hard for us to think today how a photograph could be popular. Because if I wanted to, I could pull out my phone and take 100 pictures in the next, 15 seconds. Pictures are everywhere. We don't think about that. But pictures were scarce. Pictorial images of any kind were really scarce. To think how rare that was to even see an image. People would go their whole life without seeing any kind of a photograph or an image or something like that. So one photo had huge power. And for some reason, Americans just thought this was the coolest thing they'd ever seen. And as a result, Christmas trees started becoming popular in the United States based on this one picture. Here's the current Christmas tree in Windsor Castle. They continue that tradition. This is Charles III's Christmas tree. Okay. Okay, we're going to shift to high gear now. We'll skip this. Basically, the Calvinists and the Puritans surrendered between 1850 and 1870. They said, okay, we'll have Christmas. And they made it a federal holiday in 1870 in the United States. Giving gifts, that was a slow start. People just didn't give gifts much. Ordinary people hardly ever, because they didn't have the money, mostly. However, all that changed after the 1920s in the United States because we started having more money available. This is when Santa Claus became important. It was in the 1920s, really for the first time. He was around before, but this first time. We're not going to see below. We're not going to do that point because there's too many children here today. But it was nothing like today. You know, I'm going to do a brief little thing here I wanted to do. In the 1930s and 40s, it was a big, big deal to get an orange for Christmas because oranges were expensive and they were rare. And so my parents grew up that time, and we got oranges every year until I was well into my adulthood. Every year they gave us oranges. I talked to some other people, and they said they got oranges too. So I think this was a pretty common thing. And as a kid, I was like, what in the heck am I, why am I getting an orange? You know, give me candy, I understand, but oranges? We get oranges all the time. I mean, at that point, well, it made the stocking bigger, it filled it up. But just to make the point, I thought I would regale you with pictures of oranges. And I know you're dying to see this. My first Christmas up there in 1945, there's an orange by my right foot. My parents decided when I was 7 months old to give me a gun for Christmas. You think there's nothing wrong with American culture? I got a gun when I was 7 months old. And here I am holding it up, you know, pretending to do something with it. 1959, there's an orange in the stocking. 1977, these are my nieces, an orange over there by Christy's head. Here's Katie as a little girl, 2 years old, getting an orange out of her stocking. Here's Liz and Katie, oranges out of their stockings. We didn't give oranges to our girls because we thought it was stupid. But I shouldn't say that. We didn't understand the point of it. But whenever they went to my parents' house, they got oranges, and they were always like, okay, because we gave them oranges all the time, you know, because it's healthy, it's good parenting, right? Vitamin C. More oranges. 1995 by Katie's foot. There's 2 oranges, one for Katie, one for Liz. Here's Liz racing to show her orange to somebody. I don't know what that's all about. Here's 2003, there's an orange sitting by Katie. In 2013, this is me clowning around, putting the orange on my foot with a banana and candy and taking a picture. Because I'll take a picture of anything. And keep it. But it wasn't until the 1950s when we were in the middle of the largest and most sustained economic expansion in U.S. history, still true today. It's the largest, most sustained one. That gift giving and the whole idea of gift giving and things that went with it really became the dominant form of what we did at Christmas. And that's when the tradition of extravagant gift giving took off, and lots of gifts and things like that. So here's some more pictures of our family. 1950, that's the entire Christmas in 1950. That's all there was. That was all. That was the whole thing. By 1963, it's a little bit more cluttered. There's more stuff, more expensive stuff. Of course, the family's doing a little better financially by that point. So before that, my dad, my sister Laura, my mom were here. By 1991, this is at my parents' house. It was a full-blown, I don't know, commercial extravaganza. And our girls got just inundated with stuff, and there was stuff everywhere. You know, that's just what happened as we moved through time. Now, we're not going to do what Santa Claus looks like. We're done, because I'm not going to do that part. It's really interesting stuff. I wish I could do it, but I'm not going to because it would not be appropriate. So I'm finished. That's it. That's all we're going to do. And only 5 minutes late for me, that's pretty good.
Thank you, Rich.
Do you have any comments, questions, thoughts? Thanks for sharing your orange stories.